carrying on the theme of identity, last, and I've said this along many times tonight, certainly not least, we have Dr. Abdullah bin Hamid Ali from Zaytuna College in California. Please, can you share some of your approaches to identity and the kind of complex and intricate kind of mechanisms which are involved when we look at this, and give us some advice in how to deal with identity in a healthy way from an Islamic perspective.
Inshallah. I don't know if it's going to be easy to do that after that powerful speech that Sister Imani gave, and mashallah, a very powerful message. Yeah. And I guess the first place I would begin is to recall earlier, Ustadh Mustafa Briggs, he had mentioned that Black history is Islamic history, or Black history is Muslim history. And I think Qadir Asim had made a statement along the lines of something similar to this, or speaking about, he asked the question of the importance, or mentioned the importance of asking ourselves, how many Black Sahaba do we know other than Bilal? I actually would reverse it and say that realistically, when we bring those two statements together, a more appropriate question in my mind would be, how many Black Sahaba or how many non-Black Sahaba do we know? And of course, the reason I'm saying this is because there is a bit of dissonance that does exist in the minds of Muslims about the original Arab in Arabia at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And when we read the words of our lexicographers, our historians, you'll find that they say that the majority of the Arabs were bright, they were light and dark brown. That's what they were. The majority of them were. The minority of them were white, right? And for this very reason, the Arabs themselves, they didn't define themselves as white. They didn't see themselves as Africans, right? They weren't sub-Saharan Africans. But at the same time, they didn't see themselves as white. The people they considered to be white were the people of Syria, the people of Europe, and the people of the Europeans, what we call the Europeans, the Romans, right? Those were the white people. And they didn't call them white, they called them red people. And the reason they called them red was because in the understanding of the Arabs at the time, to call someone white was derogatory, because what it meant was that you were losing your melanin, that you had what was called baras, vitiligo, right? And so that in itself further reinforces the very fact of what I'm saying here, is that most of the Arabs during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they were brown, they were light and dark brown, or many were Black, right? But that's an important thing, I think, is for us to highlight. The second thing I think to highlight, which is important, is the difference between pre-modern and modern race, right? Now, in the pre-modern period, and let's say we could say prior to the European Enlightenment, that much of the world, the different groups, they define themselves collectively on the basis of culture, language, in particular, culture and language. So you had culture-based races, right? It wasn't based upon color, right? So for instance, in the African continent, you find people who look alike but spoke different languages. They didn't see themselves as the same people. Why? Because they had different languages, they had different cultures. They didn't see themselves as we are, in solidarity with one another. But after the Enlightenment period, then a lot of things have changed, and these things, we live with these things. They affect the way that we think about one another. Like, so for instance, and so in particular between the 17th, 18th, 19th century, these are important centuries for us, in that, for one, we know the 17th century, and then of course the 18th century is when the U.S. itself, the Constitution was written, but in the century prior to that, there was a man from Sweden known as Carl Linnaeus, and he was the very first person to classify the human being in such a way that led to a lot of the positive and negative presumptions that we have about one another. So for instance, he classified human beings into 4 categories. And so the white, the red, the Black, and the yellow, right? And he ascribed to each particular group certain types of temperaments, certain types of behaviors, certain type of dispositions. Right? So for instance, white people were happy, Black people were lazy, Chinese people were sad, or the yellow people were sad, the Black people, they're lazy, the whites were sanguine or happy, and then the red people were angry. So the red people, like the Amerindians, among others, right? So he was the very first person to do that. Then the next century, a German scholar known as Blumenbach, he introduced a fifth race called the brown race, right? And he was the one who invented the term Caucasian. And Caucasian doesn't simply just mean like white person, right? As we talk about, Caucasians included people from North Africa and from the Middle East, right? So this, you can say that he sort of become one of the first people to sort of introduce the idea that Arabs were white, right? But realistically, it was the following century when a Frenchman known as Arthur de Gobineau, who actually was very racist. He has a book called The Inequality of the Human Races. And he's a highly influential individual. And Arthur de Gobineau, he divided the whites into the three categories: the Nordic, the Alpine, and the Mediterranean. So he somewhat solidified this. And then you add on top of this Darwin, who appears in the same century. And we start talking about the idea of, evolution and certain things and certain people being superior to others. Then, we start to think in very strange and very dangerous ways, right? So then eventually, once you see that the blacks are become free from slavery, the South in America, they now find themselves in a situation where, after being indoctrinated into race superiority after 3 centuries or more, they now have to contend with this new challenge of trying to share a world with the people they were dominating, right? And so also immediately you see a lot of setbacks from the very beginning, right? Because they're afraid, so we did this to them, so naturally they're probably going to do the same thing to us so we can't allow them to get ahead. We can't allow them to get power like we have. And so we see this all throughout the 20th century, you see. And so what happens, that what didn't happen during that time, what should have happened is after emancipation, was that there should have been a complete new re-education in society with regard to race. But it never happened, So people still, even to this day, Muslims and non-Muslims, all throughout the world, that we entertain a lot of very negative ideas about one another. That all of us suffer from unconscious bias in that way. And of course, the blacks, they get it the worst. And the darker you are, the worse it is for you. The darker you are, the worse it is for you. So even amongst black people themselves, we do find, especially when I was growing up, I remember this, that we would make fun of those who are extremely dark, right, among our race, right? So there's a problem with colorism, a universal problem, right? It existed in ancient China. It still exists today between the North and the South. The Southern Chinese are darker than the Northern Chinese, and it exists in India, the North and the South, the lighter people from the North, the Brahmins, opposed to the Dravidians of the South. That we find it exists throughout human history. And so, lastly, what I want to say is that it's one of the quote a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, where it's in the Sahihain, where the Prophet said, "Inna min ashaddi an-nasi 'adhaban 'inda Allahi yawm al-qiyamati al-musawwirun," that the people, or those with the worst punishment on the day of judgment in the sight of Allah, are those who the image makers are the image makers. Now, the image makers, to me, are many, right? And of course, we can talk about Hollywood, we can talk about the media, and we know that in Islam that this itself, this idea of taswir, is a problematic issue, right? And so when we think about, for instance, movies like The Message, which we all love, we love the story, that we often don't pause to reflect upon whether or not that there is some historical accuracy being promoted in that, with regard to the colors of the people of that movie. Now, of course, like Imani, she mentioned the fact that, we don't want to be concerned or overly concerned about what the prophets look like. However, we do need to be concerned about historical accuracy. We need to be concerned about what has been hidden, what itself is being ignored with regard to these things, because again, the imagery has an impact on the human psyche. Imagery has negative, both negative and positive imagery has an impact on the human psyche. And that I think that this is what a lot of people are hurt about. They're crying when people just say, well, we don't, you know that Musa was black? Do you know that this prophet was black? This prophet was black. Why? Because often Muslims themselves are okay with saying the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu was white. It's okay with saying that other people or famous people were white, right? Ali ibn Abi Talib or things like that, But once someone says, well, objections say, well, no, actually, there's evidence to say the opposite of that. Then we start to say, well, Islam has nothing to do with race. Why are you obsessed with race? Why are you talking about blackness? This is offensive to call the prophet white. It's called the prophet black. As a matter of fact, it's kufr according to certain scholars. And it's like, why don't we see that being a problem in the opposite direction? So finally, I would just say that when it comes to the idea of police brutality, well, not just idea, but the occurrence of police brutality in places like the U.S., I do believe that a lot of this is driven by the stereotypes and the imagery, the negative imagery that certain people have been fed for a very long time. I don't personally believe that in most cases when white police officers kill black police officers, and just what I believe, I don't believe that in most cases it's because the white officer necessarily believes that black people should not exist, or that this is about, inferiority. Your people are just simply inferior to me. I believe that it's something much deeper, that it has a lot to do with the imagery. It has a lot to do with a lack of familiarity, as like Mustafa, he mentioned multiple times, a verse from Hajarat, Allah calls us to become familiar with one another. Familiarity, the more familiar we are with one another, then the easier it will be for us to understand one another. And once we understand one another, then we can humanize one another fully. And at any rate, there's a whole lot, of course, as you know, I could say, but hopefully I didn't go over time too much, but we definitely need to continue this conversation.
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much for that very informative contribution, and one which, mashallah, I don't know how you managed to summarize all of those into the time what you had, but yeah.